You guys are awfully quiet. We still have like 3 minutes. I haven't even done the 2-minute warning, so you're welcome to continue to talk. All right, this is your 2-minute warning. 2 minutes.
Through joy and pain we worship. With heart and soul wide open. With heart and soul wide open. Your strength will never fail us. Your strength will never fail us. We're not lost in the darkness, no. We're not lost in the darkness. You are here. Oh, come on, my soul.
All right, if everyone could please head to their seats, we can get started. All right, please welcome our final contestant of the night, Mr. Jacob Stewart Pickering, with his thesis, Training Day, the Real Lethal Weapon of Policing. Let's give him a hand.
Practice makes perfect, a phrase I'm sure you have all heard, but it's a truth that sadly is not a priority for American police departments. On November 22nd, 2014, Cleveland officer Timothy Lohman was on patrol when he saw a hooded figure in a nearby park with what appeared to be a rifle. He drove his police car across the snow-covered grass and brought the vehicle to a stop beside the gun-toting suspect. The man, surprised and confused by the officer, casually turned to face him. The supposed rifle, which was in his hands, swung in the same direction. In a moment of fear, the officer shot him from the window of his vehicle. When he approached the body, he was horrified by what he saw. 12-year-old Tamir Rice. The boy had gone out for a walk that day with his favorite BB gun. Officer Lohman mistook the child's toy for a weapon. A deadly mistake. I do not share this story to paint officers with a broad brush. I share it to highlight the problem. I'm sure you have all heard stories about police officers who are not prepared to handle the situations in which they are put. I'm sure I need not remind you of the civilian lives lost. However, officers suffer too. On average, 163 officers die in the line of duty each year. Our policing system is not perfect, and I believe that part of the solution lies within the amount of in-service training. Separate from Ohio, the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, or TCOL, was created in 1965 to establish and enforce standards to ensure that the people of Texas are served by highly trained and ethical law enforcement personnel. TCOL is the governing body that both sets and enforces standards on police training. Larger departments in Texas often have additional training programs for their officers. As for Texas's current requirements, TCOL states that every Texas peace officer must complete 40 hours of in-service training every 2 years. This includes typical training exercises along with any new legislation that may have been passed. Officers also must complete 4 refresher courses over the course of 4 years. These courses are cultural diversity, crisis intervention, special investigative topics, and de-escalation. Each of these courses is 8 hours long. To sum up all those numbers, police officers in Texas must complete only 28 hours of in-service training each year. Now, the whole of in-service training is made up of smaller courses, and I'll be mentioning a few throughout my speech. The first is crisis intervention training. CIT deals with interacting with mentally ill and unstable people. The next course, tactics, is best explained as the skills that keep officers alive. This includes hand-to-hand combat, use of force, non-lethal force, and split-second decision-making. Tactics is not just knowing what tools an officer can use, but what one should use in each situation. And finally, communications, which is defined by multiple officers as verbal judo, the art of calming people down with words in order to control a situation. In Austin, there are training instructors who specialize in teaching certain courses. Now, in 2020, of the $434 million the Austin Police Department received, $21 million, or around 5%, went towards professional standards. All the training Austin gives its officers falls under this budgeted category. By comparison, the national average for police budgets is just above 4%. I propose that the Austin Police Department double their in-service training from 28 hours a year to 56 hours a year by extending 3 training courses: tactics, communications, and crisis intervention training. First, the increased amount of training will better equip officers in the line of duty, preparing them to make smart, split-second decisions. To follow, properly prepared officers will better protect innocent civilians and arrest suspects while avoiding casualties. And finally, increased training will decrease police misconduct and lawsuits, saving the department millions. Now, let's talk about what goes into preparing officers. It's no secret that policing is a difficult job. Having to make smart, split-second decisions with people's lives on the line is not what some would call a calm workplace environment. The police academy does much to equip officers for what they will face. But try and think back to college courses you took your freshman or sophomore year. How much of that do you remember? Probably not much. This is where in-service training comes in. I had the opportunity to interview Austin training instructor Dustin Lowe, as well as Austin police officer Brian Yarger. Dustin and Brian have been in the department since 2008 and have seen their fair share of violence and stress. From my interviews, both emphasize that officers do not get enough in-service training, especially in tactics and communications. In fact, they mentioned it before anything else. They explained that although the practice police receive in training courses is useful, the officers simply do not have the time necessary to master the principles. For example, Brian has seen his fellow officers get injured in the exact scenarios taught in the police academy. However, the lessons learned in the academy have been long since forgotten. Refreshing officers and keeping them sharp is exactly why in-service training exists. In a stressful situation, the officer will not remember unless that training has been burned into their mind due to repetition. Another training instructor in Washington that I got to interview asks his officers to spend their free time training themselves because this department does not allow enough time or money to properly prepare them. An instructor should not have to ask this of his officers. However, the feeling of unpreparedness does not stop with my interviewees. In a 2016 survey with about 8,000 officers throughout the U.S., 69% of them said that the training they received did not equip them enough for the field. Another, in 2018, of over 250 agencies, found that 80% indicated a lack of necessary training. Studies show that as a department gets larger, the amount of officers who feel well prepared becomes fewer. At departments with more than 1,000 sworn officers, on average, 75% of them will feel unprepared. Austin is a large department with over 2,000 sworn officers, and it's only getting larger. According to a study done by the Municipal Police Training Committee, 70% of police chiefs in Massachusetts said that the training offered was not sufficient for their department. Now, Massachusetts requires 40 hours a year of in-service training, which is some of the highest in the nation. It's also important to point out that police chiefs are seasoned veterans of the force who have had their fair share of training and practice. These people know what a police officer needs to be prepared. And more importantly, they know when it's missing. When used correctly, the physical and mental tools given to officers through training allow them to protect their communities and go home safe to their families at the end of the day. More practice, more preparedness, more training. That is what we should trust to keep our officers safe, not luck. The officers who took part in these studies, along with the ones I interviewed personally, are the first people we should be listening to in this issue. These men and women are the ones who would know best whether they are prepared or not, and the verdict is pretty clear. This leads me to my second point. Prepared officers make calmer decisions, which lead to fewer civilian injuries and deaths. Take, for example, a study done in 2019 at the University of Cincinnati on their 70 sworn campus police officers. During a series of reforms at the college, ICAT training was implemented, which combines what Austin calls their tactics and communications. Surveys were given to officers before the training course was complete, immediately after, and 4 months after the training concluded. The surveys described different scenarios and asked which actions would be most important in each situation. The surveys administered after the ICAT training began to change from the ones before. Officers were choosing options that limited using force and emphasized respect and communication. The answers became less aggressive across the board. Another interesting development was that in the surveys administered 4 months after the training, the answers still stayed far less aggressive than that of the control. However, they had backtracked a small amount. This is proof that training received once does not hold in the minds and hearts of officers. Now, it would follow that other training courses would have similar effects on officers. Studies of CIT training done in 1984 and 2006 showed very positive effects. Both compared the attitudes of officers towards mentally ill people before and after receiving the training. Post-training, each showed an increase in negotiations rather than force and a decrease in self-perceived aggression by officers. In another study on 180 officers, half of whom were CIT trained, there was a decrease in arrests of mentally ill people by the CIT trained officers who preferred to transfer them to mental health units. This course was put in place to foster better relations with mentally ill people, who sometimes need a little more grace from officers than the typical citizen. Transferring them to mental health professionals helps accomplish this goal. Now, believe it or not, policing can actually be compared to nursing quite well. First, nurses experience some of the highest rates of violence in the country. And second, many of the patients that come to them are unwilling to cooperate. These are two challenges that are commonplace for officers. A study of a new de-escalation program yielded a very successful result. In the study, outcomes from each patient-nurse interaction were recorded as either favorable, neutral, or unfavorable. After the training, there was an average of 78% favorable outcomes, which was higher than the control, which sat around 60%. Another study by the Australian Institute of Criminology investigated the outcomes of training programs on nurses working in emergency departments. After the training programs were implemented, there was a 50% decrease in aggression shown by nurses, which resulted in a safer environment for the patients. Lastly, in 2018, The Chicago Police Department trained over 8,000 officers in procedural justice training, which emphasizes respect, neutrality, and transparency towards their citizens. This course mirrors what Austin teaches in communications. Over the course of 2 years, complaints filed against officers were reduced by 10%, and use of force incidents were reduced by 6.2%. Now, 6% might not sound like a lot, but if we take the average number of uses of force per year from the Chicago PD, there would have been another 486 more uses of force if it were not for that training. That's about 500 people that could have been injured and in some cases killed. Now imagine what the impact would be with even more training courses. See, use of force and violence complaints mostly occur when officers are frightened and try to control a situation they are not equipped to handle. Reduced use of force shows that officers were more confident in their abilities, which led to calmer and less violent reactions towards the people of Chicago. Lastly, what does the financial side of more training look like? Well, the answer may surprise you. Issues that every police department runs into are lawsuits for failure to train and for police misconduct. First, lawsuits for failure to train can be filed if the amount of training at a police department is deemed inadequate. These lawsuits hold if the officer can prove that their courses did not equip them to perform their duties. By the early 2000s, there were more failure to train allegations being filed against police departments than ever before. The average cost of these lawsuits is $450,000. Now, secondly, and more commonly, police misconduct can cost departments a fortune. Police misconduct can be a large range of things, but mostly it occurs when officers use too much force on a citizen or act in direct opposition to policing rules and regulations. In 2015, Austin paid out over $4 million in lawsuits and litigation due to police misconduct. One such example being when Breonna King was violently thrown to the ground at a traffic stop by officers. Austin paid Breonna $425,000 for her mistreatment. Another example is Tamir Rice's tragic death. His family was paid $6 million for the loss of their son by the city of Cleveland. These incidents add up to millions of dollars every year for police departments. With better training and more confident officers, these incidents would become fewer and fewer. A great example of this in action comes from California's Bay Area police departments. Over a 10-year period, the Oakland Police Department paid out $57 million for police misconduct. However, starting in 2010, sweeping reforms focused on use of force training changed Oakland drastically. In the last 5 years, Oakland has paid out only $3 million in lawsuits. That's a reduction from almost $6 million a year to around $600,000. The reforms had a similar impact on San Francisco's payouts, reducing them from almost $2.8 million a year in 2010 to just $460,000 by 2020. If Austin instituted more training, misconduct payouts would plummet and save the department money every year. Davalis Rutledge, a writer for Police Magazine, said it best when he wrote, "The cost of training is a relative bargain compared to the price of neglecting it." Now, it may seem like double training would require money and time that the department can't offer, but it's actually not the case. The extra 28 hours of training would be spent on extending 3 training courses: tactics, communications, and CIT. Since each of these courses are already being taught, it removes the largest amount of money and time spent on training, which is researching new courses. As far as expenses are concerned, that only leaves training equipment. In the Austin Police budget, training equipment and officer uniforms together make up $800,000. This training equipment includes simulation equipment, practice ammunition, and targets. However, the majority of the $800,000 goes towards the uniforms, because completely outfitting an officer is around $3,000 alone, not to mention any broken or torn equipment that needs to be replaced. Also, double training hours does not mean doubled equipment costs, because most of the training supplies are reusable. The only non-renewable training equipment is practice ammunition, which is mainly used in the academy. Shooting days for in-service training are few and far between. All in all, out of the $434 million given to the Austin Police Department, less than a fourth of a percent goes towards training equipment as it stands. So the cost of doubling training is almost nothing in the grand scheme of things. Secondly, increased training would mean that every APD officer would need to spend another 28 hours a year on the clock. Patrol officers typically work 10-hour shifts 4 days a week. With 3 days off every week, officers could easily meet this new training requirement over an entire year. Now, officers have enough time in their schedules to do more training, but would more of the same courses really help? Well, a good way to think of extended training is a math teacher giving every student in the class more practice problems to work through, instead of the teacher merely reteaching the lesson. Dustin, the training officer that I interviewed, explained that his in-service training includes 2 different types of learning, a classroom portion and a hands-on practical portion. This latter category is where the majority of the extra training hours will be added. For example, these hands-on simulations can be an officer having to confront a suspect. Sometimes, the suspect will be told to be kind and submissive, and in other scenarios, they'll act violent and rude. The training instructors switch up the different reactions to teach officers to act appropriately in each situation. To keep the officers on their toes, a concealed knife could sometimes be given to the suspect halfway through the exercise. I could go on, but the point is, from my interviews, hands-on training is some of the most effective in preparing officers. Imagine having the time to confront every different type of suspect and learn how to deal with each one. Now imagine how much better prepared you would be and more confident you would feel afterwards. In summary, the Austin Police Department is in need of more in-service training. When a city leaves its officers with the enormous burden of policing without the proper tools or knowledge to do it correctly, it's unfair to expect them to perform their duties perfectly. We should take care of our officers and, as a result, ourselves by equipping them for success every day. Trust is built by expertise. This is why we trust our doctors, not because everything they do makes sense to us, and not because we understand the importance of every test or procedure, but because we understand their background of rigorous, thorough, and important training. The same should apply to our officers. I will leave you with the words of Greek philosopher Archilochus. We do not rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. Thank you.
Hello. There we are. All right, on Jacob's panel, we have John Hallam, who is a husband and a father of Ben, Sam, and Catherine. He's been the SLR football and basketball coach for the past 8 years. He taught history for 4 years, and he's currently serving as the assistant athletic director. We also have Josh Graham. This is Josh Graham's 4th year at Veritas as the SR boys basketball coach and his 3rd year teaching 9th grade history. After spending the beginning of his professional life associated with the government in Washington, D.C., and around the world, he returned to Texas for graduate school to find his wife, start a family, and rediscover his faith. Those steps eventually led him to Veritas and teaching. We also have Amber Compton. Long ago, Amber graduated from the Duke University and enjoyed a career in technology, marketing, and public relations. She left that industry to become manager of the Compton household, a challenging but rewarding position she's held since 2003. Her family has been at Veritas since 2009. She teaches SR speech here. She is a proud graduate of the 100th class of the Austin Citizens Police Academy. We also have Graham Donaldson, who got his Master's of Theological Studies from Wycliffe. He's the department head of the rhetoric program, technically my boss. He's been a teacher for nearly a decade and my close friend, mostly because he's my boss. He's also from Canada, so when he went to see Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift, he was expecting to see a movie about how Tokyo had been buried in snow. It probably would have been a better movie. All right, the floor is open.
Jacob, good job. So I was just, as you were talking, I was just thinking through some of the sort of the math percentages. So you said a police officer, a patrol officer has, what was it, four 10-hour shifts a
Four
week?
10-hour
Okay.
shifts a week.
And then, so roughly if he's working, 45 weeks out of the year or whatever, that's around 2,000 hours a year. You're talking 56 hours of in-service training. That's only about 3% of his time. Is 3% comparable to other forces and their training that are in similar kinds of environments, crisis environments, nurses, or maybe even in terms of military, special forces, these kinds of things? Is 3% kind of the magic number, or are these other forces, do they have much higher training?
So when it comes to other departments like fire departments or the military, things like that, I don't have an exact percentage to give you. However, I do know that firefighters spend roughly the amount, around double what police officers spend training. And of course, it depends on the state and the department. And when it comes to the military, they spend a lot of time training, a lot more than officers and firefighters. SEALs spend, and of course, I know that that's a very specialized branch of the military. However, they spend 60 to 70% of their time training. And so when you compare it to police departments, it does become 3%. Looks quite weak comparatively. There's some reasons why there's differences in training. Obviously, when it comes to military, they're trained to be in combat versus officers are trained to be in a civilian setting, not necessarily combat, but prepared to be. And so because of that, there's a difference in police training. In training between military and police. But when it comes to police and firefighters, that 3% does look pretty weak. And the reason, to give you a quick, brief explanation of why I picked 56 hours, it was really the intersection of 3 different points. Number one, it was above 40 hours a year. And as we've seen from Massachusetts, which is one of the states with the highest, which is 40 hours a year, it's not cutting it. And 70% of police chiefs would agree with me. And so because of that, when I began to write my thesis, I knew that that number was going to have to be above 40 hours a year. The second reason why I chose 56 is because it's practical and achievable within 1 year. It would be great to train officers instead of 28 hours a year, 128 hours a year. However, jumping to that number within 1 year would be a little bit impractical, not just because of the police officers' schedules, but because you could burn police officers out on training. And when they become burned out on training, which can be for a variety of different reasons, they become a little bit, it doesn't have as much of an impact. And the third reason is because it's a powerful statement to say that you're going to double training. It's something that's very marketable, not only to the citizens of Austin, who could have some pride in their police department for doing that, but also to other police departments across the country. So that's why I picked 56. And yes, it's lower than firefighters and the military. It's lower than the military for a pretty good reason, but when it comes to firefighters, there's not really any good reason why it's lower.
Very well done. Thank you so much. You mentioned some pretty fantastic percentages of decrease in incidents after some more training was implemented. That seems to be true then nationwide or in some very specific cities like Oakland. Why has this been considered in Austin before? Why hasn't it been implemented before? What were some of the holdups that this hasn't taken place before in a city the size of Austin?
There's a variety of different reasons why different cities choose to do different things with their police departments. A lot of it has to do with the police chief. A lot of it has to do with the city council and the way they lean towards incidents. One reason why this has not become a widespread thing, action across the country, is just because not very many people, there's not very many studies out on police reform, and the ones that are out are very positive when it comes to increasing training. However, those studies have not been widespread, just because there's other narratives when it comes to policing that tend to take over the conversation and that tend to cloud out any other statistics or studies. And so because of that, a lot of cities like Austin have chosen to ignore those certain studies.
You mentioned the city council. Do you know who would have to approve it here in Austin? Would the police department just say, we're going to do more training? Would the city council have to approve that? How would that work here?
So, to my understanding, the police chief has a large part in approving training and doing things like that. So, typically, it would start with training instructors working up the chain of command, because that's kind of their job, is to make sure that officers are adequately trained, make sure that they have the right courses, the amount of the correct hours for courses and things like that. Mostly, it would work up to the chief. The city council does have a say when it comes to changing department policy. However, the police chief, when it comes to smaller issues like going from 28 hours a year of training to 56, I believe that a police chief could do that on his or her own will.
Yeah, Jacob, great job. A lot of information. You said, I think, the training you're proposing would be 3 different things. Crisis training was one, right? There were 2 others. What were the?
Tactics and communications.
So is the supposition then that those are the issues, the core issues that you believe need to be improved upon in the police department?
I think that I picked those 3 courses because they really they have a really good umbrella effect to prepare officers in a lot of different situations. So, for example, to take the first one, crisis intervention training, that has to do with mentally ill people or people on substances, people who are acting crazy or things like that. And so, of course, that officers, officers come into contact a lot with people who are either have mentally ill, have mental disabilities, or are on substances. And if they don't know about those substances or about that mental disorder and how to approach it in a better way, a lot of times they can end up treating those people with a lot more force or things like that than necessary. So that's crisis intervention. Tactics, again, like I explained, helps to keep officers alive. And communications really helps to de-escalate situations that don't need to be escalated.
Follow up. So I guess to me the core issue is then, are we suggesting that, and maybe you have some information on the hiring practices, that the issue is we have the right people in place, but we need to train them better? Whereas my concern would be because of the requirements to become a police officer, the pay scale, the hiring practice and so forth, we aren't getting the right people in place, and therefore we could throw as much training at them as we want, and we're not going to be able to train up people that don't have the right moral, ethical framework, the right sort of character and skill sets and so forth. Could you talk about that a little bit?
I actually talked a lot about recruiting with the training instructor that I talked to. And we talked about the differences in training versus the recruits that begin the training. And what I'd say to the problem of recruiting is that other than obviously, like you can't get hired at a department when you're like above, I think, 35 or 40. Other than obvious things that would reduce the population of people that can actually be recruits, it shouldn't matter what you come into the police force with, whether it be your gender or your age or your weight or your race or anything like that. As long as you can complete the requirements to become a police officer. The point of training is to turn what would have been a citizen into an officer of the law. That's not to say we strip their personality away from them completely. It's just to say that we take someone who would have been an ordinary person and make them intimately knowledgeable of the law, intimately knowledgeable of what to do in each situation, to make them as objective as we can. And so that's why I believe that training is a more important issue versus recruiting, because if the training is effective, it doesn't matter who comes in, because the people with the same interests and the same actions and objectives come out.
Good job. Thank you. So you had a number of different stats from places all over the country, and one aspect of my question is should there be an expectation to federalize the training or federalize the police forces, the local police forces, or at least make some type of national mandate? And if you could speak to how the differences between different states would go, or how the differences in each state affect their policing. I'd appreciate that.
Well, I actually don't support a federal mandate for a certain amount of hours for police departments because departments are very, very different. And even states are very, very different. And so, for example, Austin has a certain amount of training it's told to do, and that applies for all of Texas. And the reason why that number is at 28, which is quite low for a year-long in-service training amount, is because a police department in the middle of nowhere in Texas with 6 deputies needs to have the same amount of training when it comes to TCOL, when it comes to their mandates. And so the reason why they set the bar quite low is so that all departments can have a unified amount of training. Because a department with only 6 deputies just doesn't have the resources and a lot of times the need to train officers as much as a larger city would. And when we look at other cities, when we look at larger cities, they typically have more training hours because of that. However, Austin is a bit of an outlier. And so the reason why I don't want a federal mandate is because every department and every state is so different that it's better to figure it out state by state because then they can come to an amount of hours that is, number one, achievable and in the budget, but also most effective for their officers.
Jacob, I want to talk a little bit about your example that you did with Oakland. So before 2010, they had $56 million of lawsuits. You said after that it was reduced, what was it, $3 million? No.
So between 2000 and 2010,
Yeah.
they paid out 57, and in the last 5 years, which would be 2015 to 2020, they paid out $3 million.
Okay. Now, and they had increased their training. Did they increase their training on the types of programs that you had advocated for?
Yeah, so when I said use of force training reforms, a lot of that has to do with tactics, because obviously tactics is talking about when to use force, when to not use force, how much to use in which situations. So yes, to answer quickly.
What happened to the Oakland crime rate over those years? Did it go up or did it go down? Do we know?
The Oakland crime rate stayed around the same. There wasn't a drastic shoot up or shoot down in crime rate, so it stayed about average.
So this wasn't an instance of police officers not engaging the public in certain kinds of crimes. Were there any major changes to laws in the state of California that would have sort of decreased officer to citizen face time in any meaningful way that could maybe be something that explains the lowering of instances where they could possibly be, hurting civilians or doing something inappropriate?
So I actually looked into any possible way that those numbers could have been changed in had a different variable. And as far as I can see, there was no other change other than that change in training.
So let's stick with Oakland for a minute. Do you have any examples of what they were actually trained to do differently? What did they do that made use of force go down? What language did they learn, or what situations did they get trained on that were different?
Well, I don't have any specific examples for you just because that evidence is hard to find, but I can talk about very briefly about what the Austin officers are taught in tactics and things like that. So I mentioned it very briefly in my speech, how they're taught what types of force to use, when to use each tool on your tool belt, when to use no tool at all, when it comes to different tactical situations, finding cover, things like that. So tactics really helps to keep officers safe, and also inversely, it helps them to discern exactly how much force to use in each situation. I'm sorry I don't have any specific examples for you, but that's about as specific as I can get.
This topic has been, quite a lightning rod in our society recently, especially with the media. And so one of the questions that I have is in regards to what is the supposed racial disparity in terms of how use of force is used towards alleged allegedly to different racial groups. Are any of these other training programs that you are recommending dealing with this supposed difference in how use of force is used towards different racial groups in our country.
So are you asking, are there any training courses in place to talk about the racial disparity between?
No, I guess more specifically, I'm wondering what has your research concluded in terms of how police officers govern themselves in the treatment of different racial communities within our country?
Yeah, so obviously that's a very sensitive topic, and so I'm going to try to be as objective as I can about my answer. When it comes to the way police officers treat different groups of people, specifically talking about race, I have some statistics here that I would like to share that would kind of help to shed some light on that question while being as objective as I can. So if we take the percentage of population each major race is in the United States versus the percentage of violent crime, it'll give us some indication. So white people make up about 60% of the population. However, they're responsible for about 41% of the violent crime, which is what we call underrepresentation, right? Presumably, they would commit about 60% of the violent crime. However, it's 20% lower. If we take the Hispanic population, they make up about 18% of the population and are responsible for around 19% of the violent crime. So they're right on par with what they would presumably commit. If we look at the black population, they make up about 13% of the population and are responsible for about 35% of the violent crime, which is, again, just how that's what we call an overrepresentation. And when we compare those numbers with the amount of, in the same year, so this was in 2018, if we compare those numbers with the percentage of different races shot by officers, because if you're committing violent crimes, you're much more likely to be shot or have officers use force on you. About 45% of the people shot in 2018 were white, which matches up quite well with the 41% of them committing violent crimes. However, if we take that same comparison and compare it to the black population, they make up about 35% of the violent crime, like I just said, and there were only 25% of the people shot in 2018. And so just using statistics, which is, in my opinion, the best way to answer that question, it's hard for me to think that there is any discrimination with police officers.
I'm going to sort of come about this question in a strange way. So I worked at a school before, not Veritas, and they had a massive shortage of teachers. They needed teachers. And even though policies were in place, the type of training that was in place, they were needing people to come through the door and apply and work at this school. And sort of naturally, the standards went down for the types of people that were hired, and also whether or not they got a check in the box saying, like, yeah, you're good to go, you can be a classroom teacher, you meet our standards. Do we need police officers in the United States, or do we have way more than we know what to do with? Or let's use Austin Police Department. Is APD understaffed in terms of officers out on the streets?
I would say that as of right now, they're not understaffed, but it's actually funny you bring that up, because when it comes to the recent budget cuts to the Austin Police Department, which, if you don't know already, starting in 2020, at the beginning of 2021, about $20 to $30 million were cut out of the budget, and over the remainder of the year, 70 to 80 more million dollars will be taken out. And so they're trying to remove about $100 million from the APD budget within 1 year. And one way they're going to take the money out is that they're going to completely freeze hiring for an entire year and not have any new recruits trained. And so as of right now, I actually talked to my training instructor a lot about the amount of officers on the police force right now, and he said that we have a good amount of officers on the police force. There's no shortage. Like I said, they have 3 days off every week. There's definitely no shortage in police officers. However, after this budget cut, there actually might be. And so the position of the Austin Police Department might actually get worse because of this budget cut.
Donaldson, is there a follow-up question you had in your mind? No? Okay, well, that's our time. We only have 20 seconds left, so thank you. Okay, great job tonight, contestants, and we'll be back here tomorrow with